Good. Well, good morning, everyone. Very early good morning, in particular to our two speakers today. Good afternoon for those, or good evening if you're joining us from a radically different time zone. And welcome to the next installment of our seminar series, Natural Law Foundations and Applications, co-hosted by the Aquinas Institute of Blackfriars Hall, Oxford, and the Anscombe Bioethics Centre in Oxford. So we've already had 3 papers in this series, roughly corresponding to the first half of that title, Foundations, exploring some key conceptual questions in the natural law tradition. And the next 3 papers, including today's, broadly speaking, fall under the more of the applications side of this series. So just to give you a forecast of the next 2 weeks before we dive into today's session, next Monday at the usual time, we have Dominic Burbidge, who's here on the call. Dominic Burbidge giving a talk on natural law and social science methodology. And the week after that, it's the final paper of the seminar. We have Jonathan Price giving a talk on, is there such a thing as a natural law jurisprudence? But anyway, for today, we have a paper on rationality without personhood, question mark, a Thomistic analysis of recent developments in stem cell research, presented to us by Rose Brugger and Nathan Elvidge, who will introduce themselves. And so over to you, Rose and Nathan.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for coming. Yes, there's not much we have to say by way of introducing ourselves. We're both graduate students at Oxford. Rose is on the BPhil, I'm on the MST in Ancient Philosophy, though we are actually both suspended right now on account of the little one sitting in our bedroom. Now, let's dive right in, I think. So the issue that we want to talk about today is the attempts of scientists to recreate in scientific experiments in laboratories things sort of resembling brains. Organoids is the sort of, broad term for when they do this with hearts and lungs and livers, and you might call these things cerebral organoids. I personally like to call them brainoids, but Rose tells me that's horribly unscientific, but I can't quite resist myself. And we want to give an analysis from a natural law perspective of what are the ethical principles around the creation of these brainoids. And when we started out by doing this, we immediately realized that seeing as how natural law ethics is so intimately connected with metaphysics and the natures of things under question, we need to say a little bit of something about what the nature of a brainoid is, which involves saying something about the nature of a brain. And so, as a broad structural point, our paper is going to lay out some of the issues in greater detail, then talk a little bit about what we take to be the ontological status of brains from within a natural law Thomistic metaphysics. And then from there, we will try to draw conclusions. So I hand over to Rose to start the sciencey bit.
Thank you, Nathan. So as Nathan said, scientists have recently been developing these organoids, which are stem cell derived entities, which are created to imitate in vitro single organs within the human body. Scientists do this by directing the differentiation of human pluripotent cells towards specific tissue types. Those pluripotent cells then self-organize in a way that ideally mimics structurally and functionally the tissues of the organ that they are created to imitate. Scientists have been doing this with 2-dimensional aggregates for a while, but they've just started to create more complex 3D aggregates that are able to recap more accurately aspects of human bodily development. So there are a variety of scientific benefits to this. We will be able to understand, and we are understanding human development a lot more precisely without needing to destroy human embryos. And we are especially interested, as Nathan mentioned, in cerebral organoids, which are sometimes somewhat misleadingly called mini brains that imitate brain processes. So the benefits are quite extensive, especially in understanding neurodevelopmental diseases. It's already been used to understand the effects of Zika virus on birth defects and to understand autism and the processes involved. However, the University of California, San Diego in 2019 published a paper showing that cortical organoids, which are organoids which are created to imitate the cerebral cortex, ended up developing spontaneously brain waves that imitated the brain waves of premature babies. And this raised a question that started to generate some literature. Could these little mini brains, these cortical organoids, become conscious? And if they could become conscious, could they ever become rational or self-aware? And if so, could we have created a person? Now, we are going to assume in this paper that it would be wrong to create a person in a dish. It would be to treat them subpersonally because such creation makes a product, and products are assigned meaning and value by their creators. So this would be to undermine human dignity. In addition, we have no idea what kind of existence it would be if we did create a person. And this could be something extremely horrific, and so could be terribly unjust for us to do. So our question is going to be, could these cerebral organoids ever in principle be persons? We are first going to investigate the ontological status of a cerebral organoid and then ask what lines should we not cross if we want to avoid creating persons, which we want to draw those lines well before the point that we really risk creating them. So I'm going to run through some background and distinctions before we get into the substantive argument. So we are going to assume the Boethian definition of a person as an individual substance of a rational nature. We are also going to treat brains and cerebral organoids as ontologically equivalent, because an organoid that could potentially think would have to be functionally quite similar, if not equivalent, to a brain. At different points, it will make more sense for us to talk about brains or cerebral organoids, and we'll try to make that clear, but for all intents and purposes, our arguments are applying to both. It is also worth noting that two sort of distinct uses of the term rationality that will be at play in the paper. For Aquinas, rationality has immaterial aspects such as concept formation, self-knowledge, deliberate action, and these capacities are not reducible to bodily organs. People like John Haldane and John Finnis have done a lot to explicate those arguments, and we won't go into them. But scientists, mostly who are not Thomists, don't typically consider these under their definition of rationality, and will typically refer to rationality as just its empirical counterparts. So going forward, we will treat sort of these two notions, capital R rationality, which includes all of the immaterial components as well, and sort of lowercase rationality, which are just those empirical counterparts. For a material rational entity like a human person, there will need to be both, though. A spiritual rational entity need not have the empirical counterparts. Next, a substance that is personal need only have the root capacity for rationality, not necessarily the exercise, and we'll say more about that. We also wanted to note what we've called the problem of observation. Since rationality has these non-material components, we can only see its material counterparts. So how could we ever know for certain whether something is rational? Now, normally we can infer from a thing's activities what kind of nature it has using the Aristotelian principle that we can look at the objects of acts and so infer what the activities and the capacities and therefore the nature, which is the principle of the thing's capacities, are. We can then also infer that members of the same species possess those same capacities intrinsically, even if we can't see their expressions. But organoids don't have kinds in the normal way. Each is unique because of its process of generation, and what its nature is under dispute. So we don't have the second method. And we also don't really have the first method, looking at its activities, because once we've created something that was telling us that it was rational, we've done something immoral. So what method do we use to determine whether or not it's rational? in our paper, we are going to attempt to combine Thomistic metaphysics to determine what is in principle possible to say about the ontological and personal status of brains, and then balance that out with what the science is telling us as well. So I'll turn it over to Nathan.
Okay, so as soon as we started thinking about the ontological status of brains, for the sake of this paper, we ran into what we considered a pretty difficult roadblock, which we are calling the substance rationality problem, which is in essence the idea that we both think that any sort of consistent Thomistic metaphysics must be committed to the thought that a brain could never be a person. And we'll say a bit more on why this is so problematic for us, but I'll just say a few sentences on why I think a Thomist needs to be committed to this. We draw it from two principles which we take to be sort of axiomatic of a plausible Thomistic metaphysics. The first of which is that nothing could be a person without being a substance. Now, this is in a certain sense definitional, given what we've said that a person is an individual substance of a rational nature. Clearly, nothing could be a person without being a substance definitionally. But there are also various other reasons from within Thomistic metaphysics why we think we ought to accept this. Perhaps primary of which is the idea that rationality requires a rational soul. As Rose mentioned, all that stuff about how the intellect is immaterial, and for Aquinas and Aristotle, that means that the seat of the intellect has to also be immaterial, and so it has to be a power of the rational soul. But the rational soul is a soul, and a soul is a kind of substantial form, and nothing that's not a substance could possess a substantial form. Again, we think that there are further reasons to accept that beyond mere definition that a soul is defined as a substantial form, but I think for the sake of this paper and time, we'll have to skip over that for now, but feel free to ask about it in Q&A if anyone is interested in our thoughts. A second reason for accepting this principle is something to do with the fact that part of what is defined, part of how substances are defined, is something to do with what we call self-endedness, the fact that organs and tools have sort of further purposes and functions beyond themselves. They exist for the sake of the good of whatever makes them, the craftsman or the organism that grows them or something like that, and are sort of defined in terms of that function. Whereas for a substance, in the sort of proper strict sense of substance, the end, the final cause, is really just sort of living the life given to it by its form. It's its own end. And we think that this self-endedness is necessary, or is an important part of why we can accord to substances intrinsic moral value. And if we think personhood is intimately connected with intrinsic moral value, we would have to therefore accept that something needs to be sort of self-ended in the right sort of way as to make it a substance in order to be a person. Perhaps another reason real quick is this idea of higher order faculties as presupposing lower order faculties. We can sort of give a biological kind of gloss on this, that in order for something to be rational, it needs to have sense perception, and it needs to have nutrition and all these sorts of things. But there's also a more, I think, substantive metaphysical point in Aquinas, in that higher order kinds of soul, rational souls, need to presuppose, in a certain sense, the activities of lower order souls, and the sort of at the bottom of the sort of Thomistic hierarchy of rational soul, animal soul, vegetative soul, at the bottom you have a substance. So again, we sort of reach this conclusion that nothing could possess rationality, properly speaking, without being a substance. I think an important point to note about this is that, like we said, what we mean when we call something rational is we mean that it has the capacity for rationality, internal to its nature, so to speak. And we think that this is part of why we want to say that why we want to commit to this sort of hierarchy of kinds of soul, of presupposition of powers, because if something can only exercise a higher order faculty by first securing certain biological preconditions, in the way that, you know, the exercise of our mental powers requires nutrition to be sent up to the brain, for instance. If something doesn't have the power for those lower order faculties, sort of internal to its nature, then we think it can't, properly speaking, be held to have the higher order faculties entirely internal to its nature. It would be sort of dependent in some sense on that, on which it is dependent for the provision of these biological preconditions. So I think the first Thomistic premise, that nothing could be a person without being a substance, has sort of got to be accepted on a Thomistic analysis. The second premise is that organs are not substances. Now, I know exactly in Aquinas and in Aristotle at least, what, you know, things like tools and artifacts are sometimes called substances, but it's sort of clear that he's using it by way of analogy in the sort of strict sense of a substance as something with a complete nature, which is sort of something in which all the capacities of that thing are had internally of that nature, something sort of self-subsisting with its own internal principles of self-subsistence and generation and motion and all the rest of it. In that sense, we don't think an organ really ever could be a substance. Organs seem to be more like tools in that they're ordered towards some end, which is a function. They're sort of defined in terms of the function that they play within a wider system. And so they don't really have a complete nature. Now, you might say, for instance, that, I don't know, like bees play a function within an ecosystem, but they're not sort of unintelligible without respect to that ecosystem, in the same way that, say, a heart is sort of unintelligible without reference to its function in pumping blood for the good of the body as a whole. So nothing could be a substance, nothing could be a person without being a substance. Organs are not substances. And we take ourselves as licensed by the science to import a third premise, that brains, and therefore brainoids, are fundamentally organs and not organisms. Now, why ought we accept this? Well, it's worth noting that the metaphysical distinction between a substance and an organ or a tool or something else like that has a pretty close correlative in biology between the distinction between an organ and an organism. Biology speaks of organisms as sort of biological wholes, unities for the sake of which all the parts work together, which is a pretty close idea to a Thomistic account of substance. Obviously, the idea of substance is a bit wider, including things like angels and God, I guess. But we think that the distinction is close enough that we can take the fact that science treats brains and brainoids fundamentally as organs. We can take the fact that science treats them that way as pretty good reason for thinking that brains ought to be treated as organs and not therefore substances. And that's not to just sort of say a kind of definitional point. I think when scientists treat brains as organs, part of what they're saying is that they lack things like internal principles of self-subsistence and self-endedness and all the sorts of things that we take to be definitional of substancehood. Now, at this point, someone might think, well, sure, a brain inside of a person is just an organ, but if you have a brain outside of a person, you know, in a vat or a petri dish or something like that, then maybe it's a different case. Well, we don't really think that we can agree with that objection, because the nature of a brain is sort of defined by what we might call its sort of intrinsic orientation towards its function. That a brain is still a brain, whether it's inside or outside of a body. That doesn't really seem to be able to affect the nature of the thing under question. And it would be sort of strange to think of them as having one ontological status inside the body and another outside the body. A brain sort of retains the intrinsic orientation to play a function in part of a system, even if it's not sort of accidentally speaking connected to that system. So taking these three premises together, nothing can be a person without being a substance, organs are not substances, brains are organs, we can reach the conclusion brains are not persons. and therefore neither are cerebral organoids persons. Now, what's wrong with this, you might say? Haven't we just answered the question we set out to solve? Well, there's something a bit sort of uncomfortable about this conclusion, we feel, that we sort of reached it in the wrong sort of way, that doing a priori metaphysics without really taking into account what the science tells us that brains could or couldn't do. I think even more worrying is that several of our arguments sort of on the way to reaching the conclusion that, you know, nothing could be a person without being a substance, had to sort of go through the intermediate step of saying, well, nothing could be rational without being a substance. And so do we have to commit a priori to the non-rationality of these brainoids in petri dishes? That, I think, would be a rather, you know, inadvisable thing to do, mostly because there's actually quite good scientific evidence, we think, that these things could develop certain kinds of powers of thought. And, you know, what if someone actually were to make a brain in a petri dish that could think? You know, would we stick to our metaphysical guns and just sort of deny that it's rational a priori, or would we take that as disproving Thomism or something like that? We want to avoid those options if at all possible. You might try to say something like, well, we distinguish between full-blooded rationality as including all these immaterial aspects and you know, what we're calling the empirical counterparts to rationality, the observable elements. And so you might say something like, well, brains, the scientific evidence is only telling us that brains could develop these empirical observable aspects of rationality. They can't tell us that they're developing the full-blown rationality. But that's also not a very good solution, because, as Rose said, we can't really ever know whether or not something is rational apart from inferring from its empirical counterparts. And it's just sort of not clear how much we ought to be willing to stick to our guns on even that one. I mean, I'm sort of imagining if we could like hook these brains up to computers so that they could talk to us and they started telling us that they're rational. Are we sort of going to stand there like angry Thomistic scientists and say, no, you're just a brain, you don't get any personhood today? So we want to be able to find a more sort of plausible ethical analysis that makes sense of the conclusion we drew, that brains are not persons. We don't want to just deny the conclusion, since I think we laid out some pretty good reasons for thinking that a Thomist ought to accept them, but we want to try to make sense of it. Now, our solution for figuring out how to make sense of this is to say that perhaps we can deny that brains have rationality sort of internally, intrinsic to their nature, if not deny it to core. What do I mean by that? Well, it's worth noting that brains are dependent on a biological system for the supposition of things like nutrition, but also importantly, sense data, phantasms that need to be there in order for someone's intellect to start abstracting from them. Now, as we sort of mentioned earlier, we sort of think that if a thing possesses some higher order faculty which are dependent on the provision of lower order preconditions, but it can't provide those preconditions internally of its own nature, then it can't, properly speaking, be said to have the higher order faculty of its own nature. And in the same sort of way, what we're saying is it seems like it's the person as a whole, the human being as a whole, that has the nature capable of providing all of the preconditions for the possibility of thought and exercising it, whereas the brain is only really playing one part of a role. It's sort of like saying that the lungs have a capacity for respiration. Well, in a certain sense, you might say that, but they really don't. They're dependent on the heart and all the other respiratory organs to work together as a whole, as a system, to be able to generate the capacity for respiration. And we're saying that brains are sort of like that the system as a whole, the organism, is what can think. The brain is that in virtue of which it can think. Now, we think that this helps solve the problem because self-integration of all the parts of a thing is also part of the definition of substancehood. And so it sort of sounds like the biological preconditions on the possibility of thought, which seem to be, you know, the ability for all the different organs to work together in order to provide the biological preconditions. Those preconditions seem to coincide in a certain sense with the metaphysical preconditions on the possibility of substancehood, namely all the parts working together for the good of the whole, for the sake of the system as a whole. And so when we want to say that the brain is dependent on all the other parts of the body for its operations, we want to say that this dependence is not just biological, but also in a certain sense ontological. And yeah, as we said, that this strictly speaking means that they do not have a complete capacity for thought internal to their nature. Only the organism as a whole has the capacity for rationality per se. We want to say also that this idea of the sort of integration of the whole as the condition for for substancehood and also for rationality makes pretty good sense of some of our intuitions when we think about various different cases in which we might think about ways in which a new human could be created. If you say took a brain dead person's body and you took a body dead person's brain and you put the brain inside the body, and at some point you've got a person. Well, at what point do you have a new person there? It seems like our intuitions tell us that, well, it's when the brain and the body start working together to form an integrated whole, that's when you have a new person, a new human being, and also therefore a new substance. And we think that the same sort of thing could be said of Frankenstein cases. If you stitched up an organ from you and an organ from you and put them all together, you know, at what point could you plausibly have created a new person? Well, the most plausible in our view point to say is, well, it's the point in which all these organs start working together for the sake of the good of the whole. Now, there's a whole range of questions about sort of who would these people be, you know, which organs does identity go through, but we don't really want to question that right now. We just want to say, is it a person, full stop. And, you know, if in Frankenstein cases, we'd be willing to say that you'd have a new substance as soon as all the organs are working together, we don't think it's too much of a stretch to imagine that if you took a brain, perhaps one that was grown in a petri dish, and you hooked it up to all sorts of artificial organs that were designed to replicate organs, that you could plausibly hold the same conclusion, that you have a new substance and therefore a new thinking thing when the system as a whole starts to work together. And that's roughly speaking going to be the basis of our ethical conclusions about this, that the system as a whole is a rational person, but a brain per se isn't. Now, a quick objection to this: it seems like if we have a brain which, given the right sort of hooking up to machinery, can start to think, or at least be that in virtue of which something thinks, that looks like it's got some sort of root capacity for thought. And we want to say, for instance, on a Thomistic natural law analysis, that embryos, for instance, ought to be ascribed personhood, not because they have the power for thought, but because they have the power to develop into something that will become rational, what is often referred to as a root capacity. And, you know, if we're saying, well, all a brain needs is to be hooked up to a bunch of systems and then it can think, you might wonder whether or not we ought to ascribe to brains personhood in the same way that we ascribe to embryos personhood. However, we don't want to deny totally that brains have some sort of sense of capacity for thought, or capacity at least for being that in virtue of which something thinks. But what sort of potency is this? Well, we don't think it's quite the same sort of potency as that held by an embryo, because an embryo will develop entirely based on the internal potencies inherent in its own nature into something that can think, whereas a brain will never be able to think entirely of its own nature. It is always going to be dependent on some other system. So it's not really like the potency of an embryo to become a boy. It's possibly more like the potency of a bit of wood to be turned into a cross or something like that. We've sort of taken to calling this kind of potency that brains have a zeroth potency. This is a sort of a bad pun based on Aquinas's distinction between first and second potency. If you remember, second potency is the first actuality of the first potency, and the first potency is something like the bare capacity to be ensouled, whereas what the brain has seems sort of one step further removed from that. And so zeroth potency follows. I thought it was funny. But we don't necessarily need to commit to the idea that that this is an intrinsic potency and therefore can't be lumped in as a root capacity, and therefore isn't really sort of personhood grounding or value grounding in the same sort of way. And with that, I'll hand back over to Rose to talk some more about the ethical principles that flow from this.
So, as we've concluded, it seems like what would be problematic is if we create a new substance that is then rational, because then it seems like we could create something that would at least be adequate material for ensoulment. So we want to avoid doing that. And it seems like we can derive sort of two main ethical conclusions. One, if we create a cerebral organoid that, were it connected to a variety of sensory inputs and outputs, we think it would be reasonable that it would integrate with those parts to create some kind of living entity. We shouldn't do that. We shouldn't connect all of those parts together. Now, it's a scientific question. Can we do this? What would it require to do this? But it does look like scientists are getting quite close to this. So I mentioned earlier that there was, the study where a cerebral organoid displayed brain waves. If I understood it properly, I think that organoid was connected to a kind of spider-like computer bio body that was having sensory inputs and outputs. But at this point, the cerebral organoids we can create are very, very tiny. They aren't vascularized. They can't be vascularized. So they can't grow big enough to have the synaptic pathways that even would get close to at least the empirical counterparts of rationality. So even in that little sort of spider-like entity, it doesn't seem like that could, was getting anywhere close to thought. But it seems like quite plausible that we could end up vascularizing these organoids. Scientists are thinking that they could do this. They've been implanting them into animals, which these chimera-like creatures, that's another very interesting ethical question that we couldn't explore. But if you could vascularize it, hook it up to a system, and get some kind of consciousness, it would be consciousness in human biomaterial, and we don't know what that kind of consciousness is, so we shouldn't do that. But an alternative, so the second point is that perhaps we could create ones that didn't reach that level of complexity, and then we can hook them up however we'd like to and get all the information that would be potentially very useful for insights in human neurodevelopment. And we wanted to suggest that because we have kind of no idea what sort of consciousness would be like in this entity, that we shouldn't create one that could ever be conscious in the first place, so that didn't have the synaptic pathways essential for experiencing pain. Now, how we define consciousness is itself controversial, but we've just paused at that for the moment. So if we create an organoid, we grow it to a certain extent, but those pathways are not in place, then we think we would be relatively safe in hooking it up and maybe creating something new, but doesn't seem like that could be a person. There are a lot of scientific questions around this, and we've been speaking with some scientists about this, and so this would be a very difficult thing to determine, but at least in principle, it seems like it could be done. So this, in some ways, feels like a weaker conclusion, because even creating these entities that we don't think would necessarily be personal seems in a way like playing God. It does seem disturbing, even if it has benefits. And
certainly hooking them up to spider-like machine bodies feels a bit like playing God.
But that requires an analysis of what it means to play God, and we couldn't really pursue that, but it's potentially something we could speak more about in the Q&A. So with that, we'd like to open it up for questions with the caveat that we are philosophers and not scientists. So if you have questions about the science, we will do our best, but probably will not be very helpful.